opportunity. I see a bunch of old friends have already joined in. Some of this will be old hat for them. In listening to what Debbie asked me to do, I have adapted what has turned into a 3-session series of talks, one on effective presentations, one on effective data visualization and data presentation, and one on more general communications with a focus on kind of the written word. So I've kind of morphed those into one presentation here to talk about effective communication. So I'd like to begin. Oops, what's going on here? Does anybody, if you're on, I think, are people all muted? Or if you come off mute, does anybody recognize who that guy is by chance? Any guesses? Well, turns out this gentleman was the preeminent orator of his day. And on a day, actually November 19th, 1863, he was the lead act at a dedication of a cemetery at Gettysburg. So to commemorate the Battle of Gettysburg, which was fought from July 1st to 3rd of 1863, in November they got together to dedicate a cemetery at Gettysburg. And this man, on that day in November, spoke for a solid 2 hours. Everyone said it was a wonderful speech. Everybody loved it. He spoke 13,508 words. When he was done, there was a brief musical interlude, and another man stood up. And that man is shown here on the right. And he began, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He continued and ultimately ended with that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So that man, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. I realize this is a little bit US centric, but I thought the A stood for America. Well, at any rate, I hope they have a predominantly US audience. So Lincoln overall in the Gettysburg Address spoke a total of 280 words. Now, there's a couple of things about this that I want to point out. The guy who spoke 13,508 words, nobody knows. The guy who spoke 208 words, everyone knows, and most every school child in the US has at least heard or knows of the Gettysburg Address. The other thing that is interesting about the Gettysburg Address, it wasn't that Lincoln stood up and spoke off the cuff. It wasn't that he was so bored with the 2 hours listening to Edward Everett that he decided to make a brief speech. There are multiple surviving copies of the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln edited and changed. So it was not spoken off the cuff. It was a planned event. It was something that Lincoln had prepared for, and he elected to only do the 280 words that he did. So one of the big messages, I guess there's several big messages here. One is, don't waste your audience's time, as Edward Everett may have done in the 13,508 words. The other is to be prepared, to practice, to understand what your delivery is. And the last is only say the words that are needed. Be brief if you can. Make the words memorable. Lincoln didn't say 87. He chose 77, even though I'm told that back in 1863, that still would not have been the most common. It wasn't that everybody talked that way. Lincoln chose that cadence. He chose that. And above all, he practiced. So in this era that we're in now, and Debbie mentioned you guys are going to talk about data visualization, we have abominations like this that occasionally show up, that people put lots and lots of time into doing things that are truly abysmal. I don't know why you would do a pie chart that you would then expand and then rotate and then make it wood grained, but somebody thought that was a great way to show where credit cards are processed. So we see a number of these abominations. People put so much time into the graphics that they occasionally forget that really it's the words that most matter. So the first point that I want to drive home is that a presentation succeeds because of what you say, not because of what you show. Now, having said that, I am clearly doing a PowerPoint presentation, so I am showing things. So why am I doing that? And the reason is that data science or cognitive scientists have looked at this. And if your intent is to have your audience remember what you say, we can look at what that memory is in 3 hours, and we can look again at what that memory is in 3 days. And if you tell and show independently, about 70%, people have about 70% recall, give or take. If you both show and tell, if you have some graphic that goes with it that triggers memories, showing and telling that within that 3 hours, it goes up to over 85%. At 3 days, the results are even more stark. If you just tell somebody something, if it's just something that flows into their ears, they only have about a 10% recall. It about doubles if you have something that they look at and can see. But if you couple the telling and showing together, you go up well over 60%. So it's that reason that we do this craziness with PowerPoint presentations. But the big point still is that it is the words that carry most of the meaning, and that's where you want to try to focus your time. And I like to use this metaphor of the slides as a chorus, that the crazy thing about this is it isn't that people remember the particular data that you show on a slide, it's that an image triggers memory. So what you're trying to do is associate something with the memory of what you have told them. And that's why the slides as a chorus, I think, is a good metaphor to think about when you're preparing a presentation. So for this, I'm going to talk broadly about communications. And on this slide, I've shown the different tools that I think most all of the people on this call will encounter, or the outputs of what they would do on a daily basis. So certainly over my Dow career, I retired in April, and I see some of my Dow colleagues on. We do a lot of email, you do a lot of presentations, you write a lot of reports. You occasionally write things that look a little more like letters than emails. You occasionally might do a video, you certainly write patents, you may write award presentations, and you may do things that get posted on the web. That pretty much encompasses kind of the work products that I certainly encountered in my career. What I'm going to do in left to right here, I think, are the frequency with which I encountered these things. I certainly did more emails than I did presentations, and I did more presentations than I did reports. So, right to left, they got more diminishing as we went over to the right-hand side. So what I'm going to focus on today is really email and writing, and a little bit about presentation stuff. So the other thing that you have to be cognizant of, and again, this is thinking back on my career, are the different audiences that I was addressing. At times, I was doing things that were very much directed at investors. I was doing things that might be directed at customers. I was doing things occasionally that would be directed more at a broad society. Sometimes they were clearly things that were intended for government or regulators. Much of the time I was writing for other scientists, either internal or external to the company. I was doing things that would be seen by people at universities, potential hires from universities, and I was doing things that would be viewed more as award applications, things like that. But the audiences were different, their needs are different. And one of the things that I want to drive home is how you have to understand what your audiences are, who they are, and what their needs are. And you as the presenter or the writer have to try to address those needs. So this is what I used as a framework to guide all the communication that I tried to do. I would always fall back on this. I don't know that I ever saw this written down anywhere. If somebody else has it, I don't know where it came from, other than I wrote it down one day and I said, this is the way I approach things. So I can claim it's my communication hierarchy, but if somebody finds, oh, somebody else did this, let me know. But the thing that you want to focus on most and upfront is the goal. Why are you trying to do the communication you're doing? Why are you making the presentation? Why are you sending the email? Why are you writing the report? Once you have the goal understood, you then want to think about who the audience is for the communication that you're doing, for the presentation, for the email. Once you have the goal and audience defined, then you want to take a moment to think about, well, what is your strategy to address that goal with that audience? And once you have the strategy in mind, then think about your tactics and then think about your tools. So the tools is the last thing that you think about. Yet commonly, bosses will come to you and say, I want you to write a PowerPoint presentation. They're defining the tool before they've defined why you're going to do it in that way. So frequently, I think we start at the wrong end of this hierarchy. And what you want to do is actually come back and say, well, is what I'm going to do best served by a presentation, or is it best served by a report? Is it best served by something else? And how do you address that? But the first thing you have to focus on is the goal and the audience. So one of the things that is just a broadly true statement is that any communication, designing any communication without the audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern. You really need to understand the audience, understand their needs, and understand how you can meet those needs. Another thing that is important in almost all communication is nobody can remember more than 3 points. Now, there's a whole bunch of different, if you read the books on communication, there's some people will say it's 5 plus or minus 2, it's 3 plus or minus 1. But the number of points you can remember is not 150. It's probably not 20. It's if you can, in the communication you're doing, make 3 memorable points, you're lucky. So I think that you, in most of the time I approach, well, what are the 3 things that I really want to get across in what I'm doing? So the 3 things that I'm going to try to get across today is, first is focus on audience, which I know I've already been harping on. The second thing is, I have here in Mind Ready. Mind Ready is an expression I use to talk about good graphics, good data visualization. What that means is that you're putting in the work in order to make the information that you're trying to bestow upon your audience as understandable as possible. You're doing the work to make it mind ready for them, that they will have to put in very little effort to understand your point, to understand what you're trying to get across. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about is preparation. It's practice, it's editing, it's being ready to do the presentation. It's thinking about how to write the report in a way that it's understandable. It's putting in the effort, it's putting in the practice, it's putting in the time. So when giving a presentation, there are 6 signals that all audiences want to hear. The first is that I will not waste your time. The second is that I know who you are. That's you telling the audience that you understand what their needs are and that you're going to try to address them. Next is, I'm well organized. I know my subject. You want to get to the most important points very quickly. And I'll talk about that coming up. And then the other thing that everyone wants to hear at a presentation is that you're done, that you're finished. So let's talk a little bit, just kind of, I don't have great slides for this or anything, but the number of times in my Dow career, I had someone who would start a presentation with, wow, I really didn't have time to prepare for this. In sentence 1, they were telling me that they likely will waste my time and that they're not well organized. And furthermore, that they might not know the subject. I have also, I think some people on this call, I may have coached when they've decided in giving a presentation that they will start with the slide of the Dow organizational chart, which I always cried foul at. I would come back and I would ask the question, is that the most important thing you want your audience to remember? And never was that the answer. So I would always say, start with something that will draw your audience in. Make your important points early. If you need to show the organizational chart for some reason that eludes me, by all means do it, but don't use that part up front to talk about an organization. So those are just a couple of things about thinking about how to organize a presentation. I will stress again, this, it's always a little pompous to quote Plato, but I'll do it anyway. The beginning is the most important part of any work. My view is that the opening slides, the opening sentence, the opening paragraph of a report are the most valuable real estate in that tool of communication. You want to put your time into thinking about what you will do to draw in your audience with that most valuable real estate. You do not want to squander it. In the case of a presentation, in this day and age, if you bore people to begin with, they dive into their phones and you never get them back. If it's an email, you risk the person actually missing your important point by not putting it up front. You want to think about those opening introductory sentences, slides, whatever they are in the communication, as the most valuable place that you have. You want to put your effort into making those be things that the audience will care about and that will draw them in. So in anything that we do, memorable is good. So you can do things like, which is better for the environment, and do graphics like I've done here, a median in a Prius or a vegan in a Hummer. It's something that the audience will likely remember. So it's always good to have something in a graphic like this that will make people remember it in the future. Is the type of thing that we talked about early, cementing the thoughts that you have, the memories of your presentation. This is one that I used probably in about 1995, where in a project review that was going on, where we had a catalytic project. And I said, well, in organisms like the human, the most important functions are down at the brainstem. So the brainstem level, issues that we have here are catalyst attrition. Everything else we're going to talk about is really secondary if we can't solve that. If we can't get that done, we don't have anything, and that's where we're going to focus. So this cranium slide, again, was shown in a project review in about 1995 or 1996 at Dow, and it's now 25 years later, and one of the people who was in that review still mentions the cranium slide to me with some regularity. If he was asking for help doing presentations, he's like, yeah, I need your help doing something, but I don't want the cranium slide. So that may sound negative, but I looked at it as a positive, because even after all of that time, he still remembered something about the presentation that I gave. So I want to talk a little bit. I've introduced this concept of mind ready. And what I mean by that, again, is that I have put in the work to make a graphic or an image or a data visualization as easy to understand for my audience as possible. I don't want them to have to put in efforts to see what I'm seeing in the data. I want to make it as self-evident as possible to them. I want it to be easily understood. And mind ready, while I generally use it with respect to graphics, it's also true about the way you write. It's about, or the way you talk. It's about, am I using language that my audience will understand? Am I writing in a way that the things that I'm trying to say will be clear and understandable by my audience? So an example of making something mind ready, and this is a DC centric thing, so it's kind of calling out to Debbie, I guess, a little bit. So let's suppose I'm going to tell a colleague how to get from Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. to the Marriott at Woodley Park. Now, again, I'm somewhat sustainability focused, so I generally will not take a rental car. I will try to use public transportation. So I would elect to use Metro. So I can pull up a detailed map of Metro, and the little stars there at the bottom with the plane shows where Reagan National Airport is. And then the other star on that red line there shows where the hotel is. But I have a lot of extraneous information on this. Over here on the right is Patuxent Research Refuge. I don't really need to know that. You wouldn't need to know that in trying to get to the airport. So what I can do to try to make this graphic a little more mind ready is get rid of the extraneous information. So I can wipe a lot of that out, still showing it on that same kind of map. There is a more graphical map, not quite to scale, of the DC subway system, I could begin to talk about that. But now I have a bunch of other lines on there that aren't necessary for someone getting from Reagan National Airport to Woodley Park. So I can further simplify this by graying out the information that isn't important. I can now go and you see at the bottom there, I have that the yellow line runs between Huntington and Fort Totten. And when you want to get on that yellow line heading towards Fort Totten, you then want to go to Gallery Place, Chinatown, which Debbie and I were just talking about, and then get on, take a right on the red line, and you want to make sure that you get on the red line heading towards Shady Grove rather than Glenmont. And I still put some other information on there, because if you happen to doze on the subway, you might like to know, how many stops you've gone extra or something like that. But I have now taken that map that had all this extraneous information and tried to reduce it back and highlight the information that's most important. What I've tried to do is make this as mind ready for my audience as I can. I put in the work to make it so that someone coming into DC and following my directions will not be able to screw up. I've tried to make it as mind ready as possible. I can simplify that even more by going down and really focusing just on the areas that are needed to get there. And again, graying the stuff out that you don't need to see, trying to highlight the things that you do. So in essence, again, if I quoted Plato earlier, I'm going to be pompous now and quote Einstein: everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So what I've tried to do in this case is take that complicated map and distill it down to the most mind-ready form that I can in order to make that easy for my audience. So this was kind of a data presentation thing of sorts. Principles of data presentation, which I'm sure will come up in the data visualization discussions that the ACLCA will host later. Things that you want to focus on are, by all means, tell the truth. So one of the problems when you start winnowing down the data is that you can actually remove the factual stuff, right? This in the wrong hands can be a bad thing. What you're doing is you're effectively hiding data points that you believe people don't know, and in trying to do this. So it's very important that you tell the truth, that you get to the point, that you pick the right tool for what it is you want to do, that you highlight what is important, and that you keep the end result. Again, Nancy Duarte had it as simple. I think it probably should be that you keep it appropriate. Occasionally, in the type of work that we all do, you will actually have highly technical things that you want to share. So it can't really be simple, but what you want to do is keep it appropriate for the audience that you're addressing. So tell the truth, get to the point, pick the right tool, highlight what's important, and keep it appropriate. So let's look at an example of how that might be done. In this case, this is a data presentation plot here of natural gas prices historic. What I've done is if I'm wanting to highlight the US natural gas price, I make the other things fade into the background, still there, but highlight what the US line looks like. So I have now, I think I'm telling the truth. I think I've simplified this, and I've tried to make it mind ready for my audience. And I think that the level of detail is certainly appropriate for who I was trying to use this particular graph with. One of the graphs that I put together that I think is the most stolen graph that I've ever done, because I've been in, I think now 8 audiences where someone has shown this plot to me, sometimes attributed, sometimes not, is this is in the chemical industry, we do steam cracking. And in the middle there is a steam cracker. You can run a steam cracker on naphtha or ethane. And what I've done here is to show what the product flux coming out of that steam cracker would be if it's an ethane-based cracker or a naphtha cracker, now where each is making the same amount of ethylene. So this is, again, an example where I believe I'm telling the truth. It is certainly not simple, but I believe it's appropriate. And I have tried to again, make this very mind ready for the audience. So it shows that in the case of an ethane cracker, that you don't get these important byproducts that you would if you do naphtha cracking. So there are secondary effects of doing that. Another plot that I pulled from Ethanol Producer Magazine is this one on meat consumption. So there's a couple of things about this that this is now a stack plot. I'm not sure that the stack plot is the best way to do it, but looking at this graph, it's not clear what the point is that the person was making who put it together. So I've done two different versions of that. The version on the left is one that if I really want to show how the eating of chicken has taken off in the US, I'm highlighting that. The data is exactly the same. It's the same data shown on either plot. If instead I want to show just the broad increase in meat consumption, the plot on the right probably does that better, but I've now, rather than stacking the individual different forms of meat, I have now separated them so that you can actually look at the year-to-year changes a little more clearly. So this is one where again, I've tried to do the work. I'm still telling the truth. Both the data is fully represented in both cases. I'm trying to keep it appropriate, and I'm trying to change the focus on what is important for the audience that I have, depending on what the goal I have in front of me is. What am I trying to tell them? What is the goal in the communication that I'm doing? So I'm going to talk a little bit, just briefly here, about human perception. And again, there are cognitive scientists that go out and study this quite regularly. And one of the things that if we I'm not as adept at Zoom as I am at WebEx, so I didn't know how to do polling in Zoom, but this is one of those where in real time, what I would typically do is ask which of these is or are the largest, there could be more than one, are the largest. And just take a moment to look at them and say, well, which ones do you think is the biggest? So, since it's asking about the largest, the top bar has never been chosen. That's always the 0 when I go look at it. But I generally have people be somewhat equally split between the triangle, the circle, and the bottom bar being the ones that are largest, with the right rectangle being the next down. I've done this now enough times that I have some statistics on it, but the reality here in looking at this is that the circle and the bottom bar are 2.5 times, or are 2.5 units, so 1.25 times bigger than any of the other shapes. And it's not instantaneously obvious that that's the case when you look at that. And the cognitive scientists who have looked at this have shown us why that is. And the reason is that in human perception, right, so I can't know what anyone else sees. I can't know what Debbie's eyes see, but in aggregate, and they've done enough studies here that what they have shown is pretty much true to what I believe my perception is, which is I'm pretty good at picking out positions when it's aligned. If you tell me that one bar is 10% bigger than the other, if they're all against the same axis, I'm pretty good at pointing that out. If instead the bars are unaligned, I'm less good at that, but I'm still pretty good. Length, depending on just completely with no axes, I'm worse. Angles and slopes, I have more of a problem with. Area, I don't see near as well as I would the position. Volume, color intensity, color hue, all of those things I see worse. So when I have plots where people are using subtle changes in color to indicate differences, my ability to actually ascertain what those changes are is far less than it is if I stay on the left-hand side of this plot over in something like position aligned or whatever. So now, why does this matter? And one of the reasons that it matters is that the tools that we now have for doing data visualization allow us to do things that seem like they forget about this, that we're able to make plots that are harder to read than we think they should be. So what's an example? Here's an example of somebody's done one of these Voronoi diagrams, which require interesting software to do. They haven't even been available. I mean, I think it's less than a decade that somebody came up with algorithms that'll even allow you to do this, right? But when you look at this, what you're doing now is the area, which are now irregularly shaped areas, which are harder for people to see than areas that are identical, are what the graph is looking at. So it's area, which we're not very good at. That was fairly far on the right-hand side of that plot I just showed. So if I actually want people to really be able to pull numbers off of something, and again, here what they've done is they've put the numbers in so that you can see them, which kind of defeats the purpose of just doing a graph, right? But if I really wanted to make a graph to show these data, it probably is just a bar type plot that would do that, where you see that China is now effectively double what the US was, not quite, but almost double, excuse me. And then many of the other countries are much smaller. If you want to look at subtle changes in the long tail, you may have to resort to going to a log plot. But one of the things that's true is nobody's eyes see in logarithmic space very well. And when you put a plot up like this, people immediately think that the linear height is what's important, and they can't do the conversion to logarithm. So in making something mind ready and being able to immediately internalize how much bigger Saudi Arabia is, emissions are than Kazakhstan, log plots don't let you do that. You have to do extra work to do that. But again, depending on what it is that you're trying to do, this plot, because it uses area, is confounding to most audiences. You're often better to do something far more simple. So this again, the which is better for the environment harkens back to Michael Pollan, I think in 2005, 2009, I don't remember which year exactly, made the comment that a Mediator and a Prius is better than a vegan and a Hummer, and several people took exception. So you can go through and do the math. There's studies that have been done, a 2014 study by Peter Scarborough and colleagues, and you can go through and you can make this nomograph type plot showing what the miles per gallon and the diet versus dietary and read on it. And it was very instructive when I did this. However, it's very hard to show someone this and explain the complications of what is effectively a three-dimensional plot in real time. So if you really want your audience to be able to have the takeaway, which the lines there would show, you can simplify that further. You can make it more mind ready. And what I'm showing here is that any car that has mileage within the red driven by a vegan is still worse from a CO2 emissions than a meat eater driving a Prius, which is the defined thing. And once you get above the 31.5 or so miles per gallon, the green part of the bar is any car that exceeds the mileage of 31.5 or whatever there will be better than the vegan will be better than a meat eater in a Prius. And the Hummer with a mileage of between 14 and 16 miles per gallon is still the vegan in the Hummer is still worse than the meat eater in the Prius. So Michael Pollan, who I don't think ever conceded, has generally been proven to be wrong. Very catchy phrase, got lots of hits and stuff, but probably not correct. So the takeaway from that last bit here is that graphs that you use to gain understanding are unlikely to be very good for presentations. Things like spider plots and things that take a while to sink in are not particularly mind ready, and therefore should be used sparingly when you're trying to convince an audience of something. They're great in backup. They're great to have in papers and things, but you should also think about, can I take a cut through and show it in a way that people will actually be able to see this very clearly. So that's kind of the end of my overall presentation, data presentation part of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that doesn't always get a lot of discussion, and one where the rules that are out there seem to be all over the place. that's somewhat true of presentations. If you decide to go through and take a cut of all the books that have been written on presentation style, I think the answer is you will likely be able to find a book that says whatever you want to do is okay, even if it is in another book said, don't do that. So there's enough noise in here. There's people that would say things like, you should never spend less than 2 minutes on any slide. There are other people that would say you should never spend more than 5 seconds on any slide. So you can pretty much find anything that you want to do. In the case of meeting suggestions, there's still a lot of noise out there about the way to do this effectively. I've tried to distill some of this down, but a lot of this is my personal observation. The first thing is about mute. It's your friend. Mute yourself if you're not speaking. And the reasons for that are things like auto-adjusting microphones, dog barks, phones, yelling kids. It's even relatively important in small groups. If you're not the one speaking, probably best to keep things muted. Mute all the users if you're the host at the start of any presentation, especially if the group is relatively large. You as the host can always mute disruptive attendees, whether that's intentionally disruptive or far more common, somebody answering the phone and forgetting that they are on speakerphone and answering their cell phone while on speakerphone. And then the other thing that I would go for is to, in general, avoid speakerphone as much as possible. As I'm talking to you, I have a microphone here that's an extra microphone, and I have an earpiece in so that I'm not pulling the noise off of my speakers into my microphone. Camera, I don't know, it's not really a mute button, but the turning off the camera is not a bad thing if you're just listening. It certainly helps the bandwidth and prevents embarrassment. I remember one meeting where a guy was trying to balance a pencil on his nose, so suddenly everybody was looking at that frame and not listening to anyone else. Everybody on camera or nobody on a camera is not a bad rule when in small meetings. I certainly think, and other people have confirmed, that trying to monitor more than 4 to 8 faces is difficult and can be very distracting. So when you have groups that start to exceed what you can comfortably fit on one screen, you should probably think about having, not everybody's camera on. And then the other thing is also share your full screen with care. Things, people will occasionally start reading their email or other things there that will, let you see more of their screen than they have, more things than they necessarily would have intended. So do remember that it's probably best to not share video. Think about what you're sharing. I'm, sharing only the one screen here, not the full screen mode. In everything will let you do that. The other part that I think gets a little, I'm still surprised by, is the lack of planning of how you look to others. So do plan your background and camera placement. I was just on something 2 days ago where somebody's virtual background kept fading into their face and all that stuff. So virtual backgrounds require a good, actual stable background. And so the cleaner that background is, the better. While I do have a number of virtual backgrounds that I somewhat like, I tend not to use them. I've tried to position things here. I actually also have a backdrop that I purchased. This is looks like a brick wall that I can hang up if something, if I really want to try to look very good for something. I do plan your lighting, avoid backlighting if you can. Think about your placement in the frame. There's rules all over the place for that. For any presentation like this that I'm giving, I feel so much more natural still standing to give a presentation. So I'm standing now. I've framed my camera so that you can actually see my hands. I think it lets excitement come through a little bit better. And I, avoid the dreaded, up the nostril look. I, for a while, wore a headset. Again, I think that people, again, it's some personal preference, but I think that in general, trying to figure out how you look and making yourself as normal in life as you would look like if you were at a meeting together with people is probably what you want to do. So I've generally refrained recently from using the headset in favor of the external microphone and the earbud. Again, some more general comments. Hosts should control and monitor attendees. Open reading rooms can certainly present problems. One of the things that is true about the virtual space is that it's a little bit harder to project. You don't see body language as well. So you want to amp up your excitement level and take efforts if you're trying to run a meeting to involve other people, call on people, make sure that you've got consensus in what's trivially easy in a conference room where you can look and see body language you can no longer see when you're trying to do a virtual meeting. Animate at your own risk. Again, depends on the bandwidth's gotten better, but still depends on the size. Even simple animations, like disappear and appear, can give very strange results at times. Video, if you choose to use it, and I'm a big fan of video when it really is the way to tell the story, can be choppy. So take steps for critical videos, do downsample them to where so your bandwidth can be used well. And then do plan ahead that audio may not plan. Audio is easy to do if you have a video with audio attached to play through either Zoom or WebEx or Teams or any of those things, but you do have to plan ahead and know what you're doing to be able to make that happen. And I was, again, just on a video yesterday where someone launches into this video thing that they've spent a lot of time doing and didn't have it set up so that it would come through the speakers. So I'm going to segue now in the last bit here about written communication, and the check marks indicate those things that actually are very much focused on written communication in the workplace. And email, I think, is one that certainly is the most prevalent form of written communication that any of us do these days. So email has lots of flaws. One is that you can't assume only the reader will see it. You can't assume even the reader will see it, right? Fat fingering, delete, that kind of stuff. Also, you can't assume that all of any message will be read. I'll talk about that in a minute. Spam filters aren't reliable. Everybody gets too much email. Even as a retiree, I get too much email. The other thing is that over-analysis is possible, even likely. So things that if you and I were having a conversation about would not be either offensive or misunderstood, when people can print out and pore over your words, they can overanalyze and potentially misanalyze. Then there's things like the autocorrect and spelling checkers. I have a former colleague, his name was Madan, that always got transferred to Madman. I think he ended up not taking offense at that. And then a famous one that I remember with some amusement is an attempt at writing inconsistency, got spell checked to incontinence, and it was a completely different meaning. The other thing about email, as far as the rules, is assume that all contents of any email will be shouted for all to hear. This is one of those things before you hit send, look at it and say, is this something that I want everyone to know? And the other way of saying this is from Kevin Kelly's 68 Rules, which I highly recommend. Don't say anything about someone in an email you would not be comfortable saying to them directly, because eventually they will read it. And I think that the email debacles continue to make the news. There are some pitfalls. The dreaded reply all. I have seen a couple of Dow colleagues on this. Some of us will remember the time that somebody did a reply all to effectively an entire Dow directory, which brought down Dow email for a day. And, because people then started responding, why is everyone sending me this? And it just kept blowing up from there. So use reply all judiciously. And then again, the pitfalls, carefully consider and check all recipients. Lots of email gets incorrectly addressed. I've had a few things sent to me that clearly were not intended for my eyes. Distribution list requires special care because selecting the wrong list can certainly exponentiate any mistakes. Recipients can forward email. And again, before blindly forwarding an email, look at it critically and say, is the content appropriate for me to forward? Is it something that I should be forwarding? Is it something that is necessary to forward? Is this something that can be more disruptive than helpful if I do that? There is no rule that says you need to send an entire message. If your particular point is to ask about a clarification on one part of an email, it might be best to break that out, send it to the names that you need to send it to, and not try to extend this larger and larger email chain. Recipients add names to email. So I'm sure everybody's been bitten by one of these things where you don't realize that someone has been added into a conversation that you think you're having just with one other person. So do check the names very carefully. So another thing about email is, again, I've already somewhat riled against the sheer amount that I get, but there have been people who have looked at how much time people can spend reading an email. And so there was this Boomerang, which is some type of email service, did a study, and they said that the average email is read and processed in less than a minute. Another email service called Litmus did a study, and they came up with the number of 13.4 seconds is what was averaged. And then the average attention span, according to Microsoft in the 2015 study, was only 8.5 seconds. McKinsey looked at email, and again, this is now from 2012. I suspect it probably has gotten worse. That if they looked at the average work week, which they said, with people, stretching the day was out to 44 hours, well over 12 hours of that, or, close to 30% or 28% was spent reading and answering email. And that was about equal to what they called role-specific task. And the role-specific task is actually what your job is, right? If your job is to, do research or do stuff in a lab, that's the role-specific task. And it turned out that email and actually being able to stand in the lab were about equal in time. So email is certainly a strain on us at times. And so we should be cognizant when we write an email of how to make it as mind-ready, as efficient for our audience as possible. Some studies say that over 40% of email is read on portable devices these days, which has a couple of implications. It's very limited screen real estate, so people do not see things in total the way they would when you wrote the email on your larger computer screen. The other part is that frequently people are already replying before they even get to the end of an email. So this again comes back to my point about the most valuable real estate being at the beginning. Drive your points home as early as possible. So effective email. Make the subject line helpful. Carefully consider your recipients. Include a greeting to signal any recipient that you need action from, certainly. Immediately state why you sent the email and what, if any, action it requests. Write clearly, write well, be professional at all times. Proofread, and then the added on top of proofread, this is really important. Pause and reread before you send. So this is a sample email. Again, when I do this as a class, I have people compose emails about something. This is one that harkens back to one that I wrote. Decision needed. So the subject line clearly defines that I need a decision. I'm addressing it to the person I need a decision from. In the first sentence, I state that I need a yes/no decision from that person about whether funds would be given. I then try to be anticipatory and say that I've included a budget in close, but it's his option to open it and review it. It's only there, it's not needed that he open the enclosure, but I have included it if he wants to know anything. I also further, again, anticipated that I don't believe we can reduce that budget any further. And then I went with the normal human stuff, right? So probably when I started writing this the first time, I would have started with, wow, I hope your trip went well, all that stuff. But in thinking about that valuable real estate, I want to be civil. I want to be nice. I want to have normal human interactions, but that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was getting to the point that I needed a decision from this person and then signing off at the end. So those are the things that I would say would make a generally good email. Brevity is important. Brevity is important, certainly in a medium like email. So this, again, I've quoted Plato and now Einstein. So let's go with Nietzsche. It is my ambition to say in 10 sentences what others say in a whole book. If you want to be a little more whimsical, so the writer who breathes more words than he needs is making a chore for the reader who reads. That would be the Dr. Seuss version, but brevity is clearly important. Strunk and White is one of the Bibles that I look at about how to write well. Vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences, for the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines, and a machine no unnecessary parts. So examples kind of a brevity, half the words with all the meaning. So this is a sentence that Peter Boyle, who wrote a book called Why Brevity Is Important. Although all audiences are different and require different approaches to produce content that appeals to them. Oops, I can't see the thing here because of the screen or my picture. Let's see if I can get that out of the way. Blockbuster content across the board always shares one common element. Regardless of the industry, audience, or approach, all successful content exercises extreme brevity. And then if you look at what he would reduce that to, it would be all blockbuster content shares one common element regardless. So he's reduced a lot of the extraneous words that actually had very little content of importance there. A similar thing is materials, where the molecular units have a disordered arrangement, but sufficient cohesion to produce rigid structure normally associated with crystalline materials. So-called vitreous solids have many applications in modern architecture, but their ability to withstand tensile forces developed as a result of impact makes them susceptible to catastrophic failure. Residents in buildings with large expanses of vitreous solids must take special care to avoid inadvertent impacts. 65 words. It actually is really just 10. People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So an example where getting rid of the extraneous stuff where it contains little content is good. So I'm sounding a little bit like the grammar police. No one loves the grammar police, but I'm going to kind of still try to make a couple of points about writing well, because I do think it matters. Avoid ambiguity, and punctuation can help with that. Again, a woman without her man is nothing has a very different meaning than a woman without her man is nothing. So punctuation completely can change what things mean in the focus. Write forcefully. Kryptonite stops the man of steel is what I would say is a good forceful sentence. Not a good forceful sentence is kryptonite could be used to stop the man of steel. Present tense and forceful again. Rope stops people from falling off mountains is a very good sentence. It's equally true, but far less good to say rope has been used to stop people from falling off mountains, or rope could be used to stop. It astounds me in the scientific writing that we do how often those last two functional forms come up. Innate reduces environmental burden of packaging because less packaging delivers better performance, versus because it allows less packaging. So the second one with the clause structure makes it immediately passive. The first is a much better, much stronger phrasing. Avoid ambiguity. The raccoon is ready to eat. Has at least two meanings. So an improvement would be the raccoon clearly hungry is ready to eat, or the cooked raccoon just came out of the oven and is ready to eat. This one is one of those sentences where I think people say there's 5 different meanings, but I only have highlighted 2. I saw a man on the hill with my telescope. It could be that I'm looking at the man with my telescope, or I'm looking at a man using my telescope. But by using my telescope, I saw a man on the hill versus I saw a man on the hill and he was using a telescope. So look at your sentences, ask whether you are being ambiguous or not, and try to whenever possible, correct that. In talking about scientific writing, I favor taking a layered approach. That would be that you occasionally have to sacrifice brevity for clarity. What you want to do is add layers that allow an audience, no matter how skilled or unskilled, to understand what it is you're talking about. You have layers that will get people to a partial meaning and still not be offensive to those that are experts in the field. Good writing is not a natural gift. You have to learn to write well. So it is one of those things where I think that you have to practice. And then one of the universal things about communication is that everything gets better with practice, whether it's presentations, writing, graphics, all of that stuff. You do have to put time into it. You do have to put the effort into it. So I will remind you again of my communication hierarchy, which is to start with a goal, then focus on your audience. When you have the audience and goal well defined, come up with a strategy. Once that strategy for communicating is in place, then figure out what your tactics will be, how will you do it, and what tools you will use. The 3 points that I was trying to make again are everything starts with the focus on the audience. Please choose the right tool for that audience, and don't let the tools get in the way. make things as mind ready, which is part of that, not letting things get in the way. Put the effort in up front to make things accessible to your audience. Put in the work. If you're doing a presentation, practice. If you're doing writing, edit. Make introductions interesting. That first bit of real estate is where you should put a lion's share of your effort. Draw your audience in as much as possible. And with that, I can pause and take any questions. And then I have a few comments about what we're trying to do with the ACLCA communications team after that. So did we have any questions come in, Debbie?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Could work out well. I'll read the first one to you. What would be a good strategy when there is a broad range of audience with varying set of backgrounds?
And again, the best one that I know is still this layered approach. Every time I've seen somebody try to dumb something down to pablum, to understandable completely by the lowest level person and ignoring that there could be experts also reading the same information, I think it's a bad thing. So what you want to do, and I pulled some of the examples out, is you want to make short, concise sentences that begin to make your point, so that you might lose the fifth grader at some point in the layers that you add, but the fifth grader will still walk away with a broad understanding of what it was you're talking about. That they might not understand what like a bis ansa complex is, but they will understand that that's a chemical compound that has a certain structure, and that's sufficient for them because that's at the level they can understand it. So taking a layered approach is the best thing that I know to do to be able to do this. Avoid at all costs this thing that I ran into, in my Dow career, where the Dow communications people said the average person has a fifth grade reading level, therefore everything has to be written for that fifth grader. And I think that's a mistake.
Great. The next question is, you mentioned how different visuals are perceived better or worse than other visuals. Do you know if certain types of visuals have led to different decisions made by the end user of the presentation?
There certainly is there's an entire book and a section of, I think one of the space shuttle disaster reports, talking about how the PowerPoint presentation and the visuals that were shown actually led to the wrong conclusion. So yes, that is the ultimate one that's been studied the most that I know of, is the presentation that was done on the O-rings that led to I forget which of the disasters it was. It was actually the graphics in the PowerPoint that was pointed to even in the final report.
Great, that's all we have, Mark.
Okay. Anybody else want to come off mute and ask any questions? If I don't hear, I'm going to pause with a question mark at the end, so you can come back in a second, but I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing. So I'm kind of new to the ACLCA. Rich Helling, who was on the phone call, I don't think I would say dragged, but that's not true. I willingly came to work with my buddy Rich on the ACLCA. And what I've noticed about the ACLCA is there's a lot of communication within the organization between people who are practitioners and less to broader audiences. I also have noted that as I've been thwarted in my efforts, that sources of real quality information on life cycle thinking and LCA are not as easy to find as you would like. I use the word rare here. And so I have volunteered to attempt to help with communications. So my vision here is not to screw up what the ACLCA is already doing. Don't mess with the ability for the community to talk among itself, but do try to expand offerings directed at non-practitioners. Do make accessible background information on life cycle thinking. What we did last year was a series of 3 to 5 minute videos by practitioners. I think that's probably a good framework for us to start with. If we can get people willing to do that, we can maybe expand that to short documents with bibliographies, which don't necessarily show up real well when you're doing just a video, and really focus on these real world examples. More effectively tell LCA success stories, which is again expanding on the storytelling effort that we started last year, and attempt to transform the ACLCA website into one of these authoritative sources on information around life cycle thinking and life cycle analysis. And in thinking about things, everywhere I look, I see examples now where somebody seems not to be doing life cycle thinking very well. And an example that I just ran into, this is off of a website, is it touting solar lights. You can donate your electric lights and replace them with these greener and more sustainable options. Well, I went through and tried to look at the rough life cycle around the solar cell with a battery in it. And I can't get my mind around that would be any more rational than me, buying renewable power, which I can buy from my utility, and doing that. And so I think that there's a lot of noise out there around things, whether, it's the paper or plastic. Is it, again, holiday season, is a fake tree better than a real tree? All of those types of things, I think, are things that that ACLCA could begin to draw people in and begin to introduce life cycle thinking in a far more real way than any place that I've seen. It seems like that's something that we can and should be able to do. So we're right at a little bit past the hour now. I'll pause there and answer any questions that anyone might have about anything and everything.
Great, everyone. Feel free to raise your hand I'm waiting to see if there are any final questions for Mark. I'll just let you know that we are and have recorded this session, and we will be sending it out to all of those who've registered.
Yeah.
Also,
and I'll have a link in there with the slides. And at the end of the slides beyond this, I have kind of my bibliography of favorite references on data visualization, giving better presentations, and how to write better as well.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much, Mark. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions or some comments thanking you and saying what a great session it was. So thank you so much, Mark. We're really excited not only about what you have done in the past with ACLCA, but sort of leading the communications working group. And thank you. And I want to thank all the attendees as well. We look forward to seeing you at the communications working group.
Yep. Thank you all. Happy holidays.